My name is Elizabeth Hunter, and I'm the Georgia Climate Project representative for Georgia Southern University. Georgia Southern is the largest university south of Atlanta in Georgia, and with campuses in Statesboro and Savannah, we are well positioned to tackle climate problems in the coastal plain and on the coast. Our campus has won national awards for sustainability initiatives, and we are currently developing degree programs in environmental sciences and sustainability, bachelor's through PhD. So we are looking to develop the next generation of climate leaders in Georgia. So, thank you. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Andres Villegas. He is the president and CEO of the Georgia Forestry Association. In this capacity, he is responsible for advocating for Georgia's $35.9 billion forest products industry. As one of the leaders of the #1 forestry state in the nation, Villegas is focused on creating value for the entire forestry supply chain and ensuring that Georgia's 22 million acres of working forests continue to deliver value to all of Georgia's citizens through the creation of jobs, clean air, drinking water, wildlife habitat, and outdoor recreation opportunities. Andres received a Bachelor of Science in Biological Sciences from the University of Georgia and an Executive Certificate of Management and Leadership from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, Sloan School of Management. Andres has extensive private, public, and NGO sector experience in forestry and natural resources, having held domestic and international positions with Weyerhaeuser, Chevron, the Langdale Company, and the Georgia Department of Agriculture. Please join me in welcoming Andres.
I have to say that was a great introduction because she got my name right. That's hard to do in Georgia oftentimes, so thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here speaking with such a wonderful group of speakers, leaders in Atlanta, leaders in Georgia, and leaders in the world as well. And also thank you so much to Emory University and all the university partners who have helped put together this conference, and also, of course, the Ray C. Anderson Foundation. One thing I left off of my bio was that I'm part of the IGEL class this year. So I'm going through the Institute for Georgia's Environmental Leadership Program. Thank you. And for those of you who've been through that program as well as other programs, you know you get a mentor and you go through a profile, Hogan profiles and things like that. And one of the things that my mentor told me was, Andres, focus a little bit more on less of the business and be a little bit more personal sometimes. So I'm gonna drill it down. Yes, I grew up in Athens, Georgia, and one of the things that I remember from going to elementary school was probably 3rd, 4th, maybe 5th grade. We had a student teacher that came to us from Adderhole, from the University of Georgia's teaching program, and she spent about 2 months or so with us. And the one thing I remember more than anything from that time that she spent with us was she drilled it into our head in our class that the worst thing that you could ever do on this planet was to cut a tree. She never told us that, you know, there's such thing as sustainable forestry. She never told us the difference between what we do here in Georgia, our Georgia forest versus one in the Amazon or in tropical forest. She never mentioned the study of forestry and the fact that since the 1800s, late 1800s, starting in Germany, we've been studying ways to be better at managing our resources, to not deplete them, and to use them and manage them in a renewable and sustainable way. And so for me, coming into this role and the work that I've done in the forest products industry, I've learned a lot about probably one of the most sustainable industries on our planet. We're able to do a lot of things to green up a lot of industries, but in forestry, especially in the way we do it here in Georgia, we can do it forever. And we can do it in a way that's sustainable for wildlife, for water, for society, and for the communities that depend on the resource. And that's every single one of us. The breath you just took probably came from a tree that was planted by a landowner in the state. Billions of trees planted in this state by landowners that are providing each and every one of us with the air we breathe, the water that we use to cook, clean, take showers, everything else. and also with the wildlife habitat that we depend on and the other species depend on too as well for recreation and for habitat to survive. So very critical for us. So one of the things I wanted to focus in on, I'll be speaking tomorrow as well, but one of the things I wanted to focus on today was kind of telling the story of forestry in Georgia. It's one that we don't hear about very much, unfortunately. And before, in my intro, you may have caught there, we've heard a lot about number ones, right, today, and blueberries and telecommuting and other things like that. How many people in this room knew before just a few minutes ago that we live in the number one forestry state in the nation? Can I get a show of hands? Well, now you can all raise your hands because you all know, right? And that means a tremendous amount, because forestry is way beyond what that student teacher wanted to drill into my head when I was a kid. It's way beyond just cutting a tree. It is wildlife habitat. It is products that all of us depend on for our survival, comfort, and our progress. And when we talk about climate change, forestry possibly has one of the single most impactful opportunities for us in terms of carbon in particular. We believe that it's probably one of the most powerful tools that we have to produce clean air on this planet. And one of the reasons we say that is because it's the process or the technology or the practice that can be done at a scale that can't be touched by anything else. And that scale gives us way more than a singular benefit such as carbon. It gives us benefits that go well beyond anything that we can measure. And oftentimes on the environmental side, of course, we can measure the economic side of that too as well. So I'm going to be speaking a lot more in depth about these things tomorrow. But today I wanted to kind of frame what that looks like a little bit at a high level. So what does forestry look like in Georgia? We wanted to show you this map here. All the dark green that's on that map right there shows you where we have national forests. And so those are public lands, those are national forests that we have in the state. You can see obviously the Okefenokee Swamp down in the southeastern part of the state, the Chattahoochee National Forest in the northern part of the state. But that lighter shade of green, those are our privately held forests. 22 million acres of privately held forest in this state, generating those carbon benefits and all those other things I mentioned to you. And oftentimes people say, well, are you just growing those trees in rows and like toothpicks or whatever it may be? And we hear that. And the answer is no. Half of our forests in the state are hardwoods, slow growing, providing a very different types of habitat and ecosystem. And the other half is pine, is softwood, and a variety of different species. I know a lot of people in this room have probably heard about longleaf, and that's an important part of our ecosystem, but as well, loblolly is a very important commercial species that provides a lot of those same benefits that other species do too as well. But about half and half of our timber species in the state are split between hardwoods and pine. And the other element that's very important about this particular slide is we're touching almost the entire state. When you think about forestry, it's not just South Georgia, and it's not just the mountains north of here. It's the entire state. And when we think about that, that's apolitical. That's R&D and I and whatever else. It's just gender neutral. There's no male or female. There's no racism. This is everybody and everywhere. And that's one of the things when we talk about what forestry does for the state of Georgia and for the world at the end of the day, from what we can do here sustainably in the state, it has a massive impact at scale. And this is one of the most important things that really differentiates us from a lot of other places. The most important thing that you need to remember, though, as you see this scale across the state, almost all of this management here is guided. It's guided by people who have been trained foresters, who have been through universities, who understand the scientific principles of wildlife management, of biology, of hydrology, of endangered species management, and of sustainable harvesting, management, and movement of products as well. And a lot of it's driven by the fact that those trees have a commercial value at the end of the day. Now, this is really important for us to remember, because the reason that we have all those trees, there was a point in time when Georgia did not have that. We're probably on our third forest here in this state. Our old growth was decimated by the early colonists that first got here and basically chopped down almost anything they could find to send it to Europe and other parts of the world. And then that land was then used for agriculture very intensively, and we've seen the impacts of that. If those of you have been to Providence Canyon, you can see the erosion and the impacts of that too as well. And then we grew it back. And one of the big reasons we grew it back was because we started to see industrialization of mills that could produce lumber and could produce paper products and things and other things that we need for our housing and that we need for basically the roofs over our heads in different ways, and packaging too as well. And why is this important? There's no other state that comes nearly close to us in terms of its economic impact on the forestry side, almost $36 billion in economic activity. But why is it important when we talk about climate? Because when we specifically drill down to water and carbon, this is where we start to see those opportunities where we bridge that carbon opportunity into the way that we manage our forest and giving people more reasons to manage their forest sustainably and not simply abandon them or let them become prone to fire or to disease, to be a great wildlife habitat, and more importantly, to be something where we can hopefully in the future see an awesome carbon sink. So, we also provide about 147,000 jobs in the state. 15,000 of those are here in Atlanta. So we have both an urban and a rural impact. Now that's very important because these jobs are spread out throughout the state. But when we've been talking to folks lately, this is a picture of Dwight. He works out of Albany, and on the other side is Harry there. He works out of Dublin, Georgia. Harry and Dwight, Dwight's a GIS specialist. He flies drones and does a lot of mapping and does a variety of other things. And Harry, as you can see, is a logger. But both of these folks are actively engaged with about the 450,000 forest landowners that exist in this state. They're working with them every day to figure out what's the best way that we can manage that resource. What's the best way that we can support that resource to make sure that it'll continue growing and sequestering carbon and providing those other resources that we hold so dear. And what worries me oftentimes is that we've seen the impacts of hurricanes. We've seen the impacts of mills closing. We've seen the impacts of higher costs of doing business, of $5 a gallon diesel fuel just a few years ago. And that the people that they work with and for are saying, we're not sure that we want to keep planting trees. We're not sure that this is the best use of our land. In particular, the closer you get to Atlanta, where you have people that are inheriting land for the second or third generation inheriting land and saying, I can do a lot better if I sold this land for development. And that's a permanent loss of air, water, wildlife resources that we all absolutely depend on. So when we think about guys like Dwight and guys like Harry and the other men and women that work in our industry, I really oftentimes think about how can we make sure that landowners are still choosing to grow trees, because they do have options, especially as we continue to hear from ARC and other places that we're adding millions of people to our population. And the number one threat that we have to our forests and wildlife resources is urban growth. And so what else does forestry look like? What is forestry? Well, it's awesome wildlife habitat. There you can see red cockaded woodpecker and a gopher tortoise. Now these are things that oftentimes, as I go out and I drive all over the state, right? And I keep seeing these solar farms popping up everywhere, and I think that's good. We need solar energy. But I worry what happened to the gopher tortoise and the woodpecker and all these other things that depended on hopefully what was the forest that may have been there before, or the other types of land uses. But the most important thing for us to remember is that, and I want to convey, is that these species oftentimes exist because of the sustainable forest management that we have in the state across those 22 million acres. It's not by accident that we're the 6th most biologically diverse state in the nation. And it's not by accident that in 1906, we started a forestry school at the University of Georgia that's helped implement the scientific principles that have helped us get to this point. Looking not only at how do you grow a tree, but how do you manage your wildlife resources, how do you manage recreation, and how do you manage your water resources too, all at the same time. All in concert with one another, all sustainable. And obviously 65% of all the watersheds in Georgia flow through forests. You saw that the earlier picture, right? The green on the map. 2/3 of every raindrop that falls on the state is hitting forest land. That water is penetrating, instead of running right into gutters, it's penetrating into our aquifers. It's being filtered before it gets to streams. It's being cleansed before it gets into streams. And that is an absolutely critical thing for a state that is growing population. for a state who's arguing with its neighboring states who owns that water and where does it come from. And so for us, we focus a lot, and you may have noticed at the very beginning, we had both our foundation and our association logo on this presentation. We're really thinking really hard, especially with resources from our foundation, what does that water and carbon resource and the wildlife resource look like 50 years from now? And how do we make sure that we can continue to provide this service today that is free? There's not a single landowner, a small portion, but basically no landowner gets paid for this service that they're providing to every single one of us, 10 million Georgians, right? You didn't have to pay for that breath of air you just took, right? So these are the types of things when we say, where are the opportunities for us to think about? The other component is, how many people in this room know that Georgia actually established a carbon registry about 10 years ago? Very few folks. The State Forestry Commission created a registry to allow landowners to start accruing their carbon for companies and industries for the day that large industry, a Delta or whoever it is that said we want to offset our footprint, they could actually go to a Georgia landowner and say we will buy that carbon that you are sequestering in those trees. Now hardly anybody has taken advantage of that because the markets haven't developed in the ways that we had hoped. But we have been very aggressive in this space. The other component of that for us, hopefully in the future, may be similar market mechanisms around water so we can encourage sustainable management. Other components of this are recreation. And this is where a lot of folks here in Georgia and in the urban areas really connect to forestry, but they think of forest as more national forest than maybe working or productive forest. But about 58% of Georgia's population connects with our outdoors, some type of outdoor recreation. Whether that's hiking or hunting or bird watching, it's a big part of what makes us Georgia. It's a big part of what people identify with in their free time. And also through their investments. There's a lot of folks here in Atlanta that have investments throughout Georgia for them to be able to get away from the city and be able to enjoy all that nature has to offer. So for us, this is an important part of our economy as well, generates somewhere between $6 to $8 billion in economic activity for the state. So very important that we kind of drill down to where we see this for us too as well. I mentioned Georgia has established a carbon registry, one of the first states in the nation to do that for the forest resource. Looking forward to that opportunity where we can engage and help landowners engage in the marketplace where carbon has a value. Quite frankly, today for a landowner to register their carbon, oftentimes it costs them more to do it than they could ever sell the carbon for. So there's not really an economic driver there. There's not a reason to go out and do that. But for us, when you think of a tree, half of it's water and the other half of it's carbon. The more trees we grow, the more carbon we sequester. The better we manage those trees, the healthier they are, the more they can sustain and resist drought. Droughts that we know that are coming that are more prevalent and longer. And sometimes when you see everything green around you, it's hard to know that we're in a drought, but believe me, if you go out into the forest and you see those trees under stress and you can hear pine beetles chomping away inside the trees, you know it's very real. And so for us, that management component is huge. It goes well beyond just getting a tree in the ground. It goes into that management component to make sure that tree is going to be healthy and survive. A 50% survival rate doesn't do anybody any good. A 98% survival rate is where we actually start making a difference. And I'll let you do the math, but on an annual basis, there's about 300,000 acres that are up for reforestation in the state. And most of our landowners, if they're planning on a plantation rotation, are going to do about 500 to 600 trees per acre. That's how many trees are going in the ground in the state every year. That's a huge number. So for us, as we look forward into the future, we know that there's a lot of tremendous opportunities for us, really to make sure that we can continue and expand the management of our forest resources. That we think about where our wood products come from. That we think about when we're building big buildings here in Atlanta, or on university campuses, or even homes, that every stick of lumber, every plywood panel that goes into that forest that was produced here in Georgia, or at least in the United States, is coming from a sustainable resource and is helping our landowners make sure that they can keep that forest healthy, but more importantly, It's sequestering carbon for 80, 90, 100, 200 years in the life of that building. It's also giving us that opportunity to put another tree in the ground. And that's where we win the game, so to speak. That's where we create more carbon opportunities to start doing something at a statewide scale that we've been doing for a while, but that we can do even better with healthy markets and with great opportunities for drawing that out. Also, when we think about where we can do on our water resources, to make sure that those landowners have every incentive to not sell that land, to not turn it into the next warehouse, to not turn it into the next neighborhood, and think more sustainably about how we're developing our cities, how we're growing our urban areas, and how we do that in a way that's compatible with what we do best in this state, what made us the #1 forestry state in the nation. And that's growing trees sustainably with scientific management that provides for our survival, our comfort, and our progress. So I look forward to talking to you a little bit more about that tomorrow and a little bit more in depth. Thank you.